Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about something a bit more dark and depressing, but sometimes that's life. Today I want to talk about kamikazes, but a little less about their effectiveness, and a bit more about why some countries, some groups, and some people engage in, to put it in a YouTube-friendly manner, self-sacrifice actions. I think we can start by breaking it down into two categories: individual motivation and doctrinal motivation. In the individual motivation category, we have individual stories of people giving themselves up for some kind of greater good, or at least a perceived greater good. From the soldier standing his ground to give his comrades the chance to retreat, or the soldier throwing himself on a grenade to save his unit, or maybe the firefighter running into a burning building to save someone. These individual acts of self-sacrifice come down to an individual person making the determination or snap judgment that putting their own life on the line for the sake of others is the most optimal decision. Of course, these kind of acts aren't always positive, and in the same category could be terroristic actions taken by somebody that's deluded into thinking that they're saving the world, or something of that nature. But simply put, the individual motivation category is just that: somebody personally coming to the self-sacrifice conclusion. On the other hand, we have the doctrinal motivation category, where we see societies, cultures, and larger entities ingraining into their beliefs and actions the concept of self-sacrifice. It's in this category that we can find things like Japanese kamikazes, Islamic jihad, and Norse mythology with Valhalla, and admittedly the Norse one differs quite a bit from the other two, but I still think it follows the same vein, in that there is some kind of broader ideology being followed by a group that promotes, idealizes, or romanticizes the concept of self-sacrificial actions. In Norse mythology, for I think the less destructive side of the doctrinal category, part of their mythology makes dying in battle a good thing, not a bad thing. The warriors that perish on the battlefield either get sent to Valhalla to the god Odin, or to Folkvangir, I know I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, to the goddess Freyja. Either way, the warriors are brought to the gods, and at least in the case of Valhalla, they reside in a great hall, eating, drinking, and sparring. Effectively, for Norse mythology, warriors are rewarded greatly in the afterlife for dying in combat, thus promoting the idea of doing so and engaging in actions that may result in one's demise. Then, as we get to the more socially destructive and terroristic side of the doctrinal category, we find things like kamikazes and jihadist martyrs. In the former, kamikazes were born out of a combination of Bushido culture, reverence for the emperor, and general societal pressures. Bushido culture, which in turn led to strong overall cultural and military beliefs that being captured by the enemy and surrendering was deeply dishonorable, led to Japanese soldiers seldom surrendering and fighting to the death, and going down with the ship, both figuratively and literally in some cases. In the latter case, for things like jihadist martyrs, they use a very literal interpretation of parts of the Quran, where it states that basically dying for God absolves one of their sins. And this general idea has been utilized by theocratic governments and entities that are largely in the Middle East, which in turn further adds to the quagmire that is basically the entirety of the Middle East. Now, the reason that the Middle East is the way it is right now is a whole other subject that we really don't have time to get into, because there's a lot there. But the point is that some societies, some cultures, some groups emphasize self-sacrifice, dying in the field of battle, and martyrdom. But for a country, a group, or an entity that does not emphasize these things, what exactly would make them start to shift over into? And how would that start to manifest itself? It's this general idea that I want to focus on today, as it directly relates to our subject, where a military and society that was based a lot more about preservation and expanding their specific group attempted to turn over to using kamikaze-style self-sacrificing weaponry. What was that weapon? Why did they do it? And what was the justification? This is a German attempt to create a kamikaze jet plane. This is the Fieseler Fi 103R Reichenberg. Now, as a society, as a culture, Nazi Germany was generally pretty far away from emphasizing and promoting self-sacrifice. There certainly are some elements that do emphasize those things. I think the clearest example is the whole Horst Wessel story, and him becoming a martyr and effective national legend, and also the fact that they were a very militaristic society that wanted the men to be strong and athletic, fighters and soldiers for the country, but more broadly, towards the center of their ideology was the desire to grow quote-unquote their people, to procreate and foster as many children as they could, and to make their people the dominant people. This, of course, would then mean that sacrificing oneself and reducing the number of their people would be kind of antithetical to their greater stated goals. So how then did Germany go from very much not wanting their people to die to making a kamikaze plane that would almost certainly lead to the death of the pilots inside? The answer is actually pretty simple. Desperation. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and as World War II progressed through 1943 and into 1944, Germany increasingly found itself on the losing end of things, and they were losing ground and losing a lot of the footholds they had gained in the previous few years. Germany's failure to take Stalingrad in early 1943 on the Eastern Front is one of those major turning points in World War II that started to lead to their downfall. And later on in 1943, Germany and Italy would lose control of North Africa. Sicily would be invaded by Allied forces, and Italy would officially surrender, although an effective puppet state in North Italy was formed shortly thereafter. But the walls were starting to close in on Germany, in anticipating an eventual Allied invasion from the general direction of Britain. They started looking into more drastic measures, from superweapons to kamikazes, and the Fieseler Fi 103R Reichenberg effectively combined both of these into one. Back in the late 30s and into the early 40s, the Reich Air Ministry authorized a project by a Paul Schmidt to construct a pulsejet engine. This more rudimentary type of jet engine is aptly named, as it doesn't fire continuously and so is not a continuous source of thrust, but rather fires in intervals or pulses. Fuel is injected into a chamber and mixed with air. The air inlet is then closed and the mixture is ignited, which then provides a burst of thrust out of the exhaust. It was under this general idea that the Argus AS-14 engine would be created, which delivered 660 foot-pounds of thrust per pulse at sea level. In late April 1941, testing with a more rudimentary version of this engine was done on a Gotha Go 145 biplane, and subsequent testing on simple glider frames showed that the pulse jets could indeed power an aircraft relatively safely into the air and back. However, at this stage, the Luftwaffe and Air Ministry weren't terribly interested in making some kind of aircraft or bomb powered by one of these engines. Paul Schmidt had actually submitted a design back in 1934 or 35 for a flying bomb cruise missile that was powered by a pulsejet that he hadn't made yet, but it was not well received back then, and even by 1941, despite his project now having some level of funding and research, the Air Ministry still didn't seem too keen on it. And honestly, they didn't have much of a reason to be at the moment. In late April 1941, while Great Britain hadn't been defeated, British and Allied forces were being pushed back in North Africa, and Germany was nearing the start of their invasion of the Soviet Union. And when that invasion started, Germany rapidly gaining large swaths of Soviet land probably led them to believe that the defeat of the Soviets was near. But as we know now, that defeat never happened, and German fortunes in North Africa started fluctuating. By mid-1942, the Eastern Front had ground down to a back-and-forth slog, as too had North Africa. The war was starting to stagnate, and with America now directly involved in World War II after Pearl Harbor, things were only bound to get more difficult in the near future. So at this point, why not start seriously looking into, say, a pulsejet-powered cruise missile that can hit Allied land and sea targets? And in June 1942, the Air Ministry approved work to begin on a pulsejet-powered flying bomb, to be a collaborative effort by Fieseler, Argus, Walter, and Siemens for the bomb, jet, catapult, and guidance system, respectively. Measuring in at 8.32 meters long, 5.37 meters wide, and 1.42 meters tall, the Fieseler Fi 103, also known as the V1, was externally a pretty simple design, with a pointed oval-shaped fuselage, basic square wings, a basic tail with square horizontal and vertical surfaces, and a jet engine slapped on top of it. The real meat of the design was on the inside, and around mid-fuselage, just behind the wings, would sit the explosives, upwards of 1,870 pounds, attached to an impact fuse. In the nose would be its guidance system, an autopilot system that once the missile reached a predetermined distance, locked up its control surfaces and set the bomb into a dive. The range of this bomb was rather limited, partially due to early jet engines just inhaling fuel, and partially due to the missile's smaller size, but with a full bomb load, the 103 had a range of 150 miles. If the bomb load was cut in half and more fuel was added in, that range increased up to 230 miles. And flying at speeds upwards of 400 miles an hour, at least in mid-1942, there were few planes, if any, that would be able to catch up to a full-speed Fi 103. Initial testing of the V1 started in December 1942 and continued through 1943, and construction of the Fi 103 launch sites began in September 1943. Their initial target was Great Britain, and because of their relatively short range, the launch sites would have to be constructed in northern France near the coastline. While this did give the missiles the opportunity to hit basically anywhere in Great Britain, it also meant that the launch sites were easily within the range of British aircraft that were flying recon, and after the sites were spotted, Allied bombing raids began targeting these sites, damaging them and delaying the eventual combat use of the V1 rocket. While these launch sites were being built, destroyed, and then rebuilt, German military fortunes continued to deteriorate, and as stated earlier, fearing an Allied invasion, Germany wanted something that could adequately take out Allied landing forces, destroying the landing ships, the other ships that came along for moral support, and any units or squads that managed to survive and make it to land. The normal Fi 103s could technically do that, but the targets were moving targets. Targets that weren't just sitting in place that would allow those aiming the V1s enough time to make the necessary calculations for the autopilot system. So the logical next step, I guess, was to make a human-controlled bomb, to allow for that snap judgment, that on-the-fly aiming. While the Fi-103 seemed like the most logical choice for this mission, with the 103 in production, and with the launch pads in the process of being built in northern France, realistically the 103 should have been the clear choice for making a manned guided bomb. But instead, a different plane was selected initially in the Messerschmitt Me-328, a pulsejet-powered plane that was less developmentally along than the Fi-103 was, and presumably in the event that the Me-328 just didn't work out, a sort of backup project started to see testing roughly around May 1944, and surprisingly it still wasn't the Fi-103 that was selected. Instead, it was the Focke-Wulf FW-190, and a version of it that just had a really big bomb attached to it. Why exactly they seem to be allergic to using the Fi-103 here, I am unsure, but by mid-1944, the Me-328 project hadn't really borne any fruit, and the FW-190 project, with that big bomb attached, was just too lumbering and vulnerable to enemy fire, and so the Luftwaffe's desperation was growing. This would then allow Otto Skorzeny, a lieutenant colonel in the Waffen-SS, who was relatively close, personally, to Hitler, to successfully push the idea of using the Fi-103 as a manned guided bomb. He had apparently been pushing the idea since at least earlier that year, but was continually rebuffed. But now, with the situation more dire, his idea was finally accepted. Work on the piloted Fi-103s, shortly after given the name of Reichenberg and designation of Fi-103R, would be handed over to the German Research Institute for Sailplane Flight, or DFS for short, and in just about 2 weeks' time, production prototypes and training versions had already been made. An insanely quick turnaround. They must have been working really hard. But really, they already had the bulk of the plane made, and they kind of just had to rework the insides a little bit, throw on some control surfaces for the pilot, and slap in a cockpit, and they were good to go. The dimensions of the 103R were just about the same as the baseline Fi-103, but it was slightly shorter lengthwise and slightly wider, likely due to an alteration in the explosive charge and the addition of the control surfaces on the wings. Inside, the cockpit on the Reichenberg was very small and simple, placed just under the air intake on the pulsejet. Inside of it was an incredibly bare-bones setup, with a small set of gauges and instruments, to go with a simple control stick for the pilot, who himself would be sat on a simple plywood seat. Comfort was clearly not the goal here. The cockpit canopy would hinge backwards towards the pulsejet air intake, and at least in theory, it was designed with the intent of allowing the pilot to bail out before colliding with his target. Initially, 4 different 103Rs were made, in the Reichenberg 1, 2, 3, and 4. The 1 was a single-seat gliding trainer that didn't have a pulsejet, but added in some landing skids. The 2 was largely the same as the 1, but added in a second seat in the nose, likely for some additional data gathering. The 3 was the first powered trainer, with landing skids, and the 4 was to be the full-scale production version, that took out the landing skids and would put in the explosive charge in the nose. The full-scale production version would operate a bit differently than the unmanned baseline Fi-103, and instead of taking off from the launch sites that were already made, and already being used. For some reason, they decided not to use those. Instead, the Reichenbergs would be parasite planes that were attached to Heinkel HE-111 bombers, one or two of them to a bomber. This made the Reichenbergs basically just Germany's version of Japan's Oka. But at the very least, the German pilots were given the opportunity to bail out and maybe survive. That survival chance, though, was basically nil, and it was assumed that those flying in the 103R would not survive. To pilot these death traps, the Luftwaffe would not be enlisting their normal pilots, and instead they would issue a call for volunteers, people that would willingly sign up for this deadly mission. More likely than not, it would be young soldiers, new recruits and the like, that would voluntarily sign up for the so-called Leonidas Squadron. This then takes us back to the question of why and how these kind of self-sacrifice acts come about, how they get justified, and get the common man to believe in it. Why would a young soldier in Germany be more willing than the old veteran to take part in the Leonidas Squadron? The answer: societal influence and propaganda. For those young recruits, barely adults, by 1944, they had spent the majority of their life subject to Nazi propaganda. They grew up with things like the Hitler Youth and whatnot. This was what they knew. This was their life. For the older veterans, people that grew up in Weimar Germany, and perhaps also served under the Weimar government, they were far less ideologically attached and driven, and were influenced far less by the decade-plus of propaganda that they had been subject to. At least according to various stories, when old veteran soldiers were tasked with being guards in concentration camps, they were often a lot nicer to the prisoners than the more hardcore, ideologically driven SS. Of course, it's not like they were treating them great or anything, but there was supposedly a noticeable difference. But anyway, back to the 103R, test flights would begin around September 1944, and the results honestly weren't fantastic, with the first couple test flights ending in crashes. After some more experienced test pilots entered the program, notably in Hanna Riesch, the crashes in the test flights continued. Ultimately, even with a good pilot, the Fi-103R was just not a well-flying plane, with a very high stall speed that led to a lot of the crashes. But also, considering that they were disposable planes that normally wouldn't be trying to land and so would not be reaching that stall speed, these testing issues were ultimately not that impactful or negative in the grand scheme of things. But still, by the next month, by October 1944, regardless of how the 103R was testing, the project had lost most of the interest in it, and it was all but dead. This was largely due to a change in leadership in the KG-200 unit that the Leonidas Squadron was part of, and their new leader, Werner Baumbach, was not a fan of the 103R concept, nor was he a fan of the whole self-sacrificing thing. He was much more a fan of the Mistel planes, that basically just flung empty bomb-laden aircraft frames at enemy targets. But with that shift in leadership, the German Kamikaze plane was now effectively dead. So ultimately, the thing that drove Germany towards kamikaze and self-sacrifice actions was pure desperation, but at least partially because there was no greater doctrine that promoted self-sacrifice. It was a lot harder to convince soldiers and military leadership alike to actually go about doing that on a widespread scale. Some people jumped on board, the most ideologically driven, but they numbered rather few, and that was largely it. And now, normally, this is where I'd think of some final note to end the video on, but to be honest, I could not think of anything for the life of me. And so with that, we're gonna go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Sometimes you just gotta end the video. You just gotta wing it. And sometimes you just have to admit that you couldn't think of anything clever. And you just move on. And that's life. Sometimes brain just no work. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.